All right, hey guys. So this week we're going to be jumping into color, and I have some exercises planned to go into more about color. But first, I wanted to just give a quick introduction and overview behind the nature of color and some of the terminology that we use when we're talking about color. So first of all, what is color? Well, color is essentially light. And if we recall from the earlier videos, right, we have the 8-bit RGB function, or color mode. And if we remember, that allows us to have a possible 16 million colors, over 16 million colors. And the human eye, of course, we discussed before, the human eye can only distinguish about 10 million colors, which is still an astronomical amount of color. So what do we do with all these color options, and how do we go about manipulating and controlling the color that we want our viewers to see? Well, the first thing we should clear up is there are three main components to color, and that is our hue, our saturation, and value. Now, you've already heard me kind of say some of these terms, but now I just want to go into a bit more about what I actually mean when I say things like saturation and value and hue. So, first off, hue is the dominant wavelength, and it's the primary term that we use when we're talking about color. So, the first thing that we notice about something is whether it's red or yellow or blue, and that's the hue that I'm talking about there. And next is value, and value refers to the lightness or darkness of a particular hue. And we usually think about black and white when I talk about value, right? That's the easiest way to kind of see it demonstrated in practice, but value applies to all color. All color could have lightness or darkness to it. And one way that we can see this is if we add white or black. If we're talking about pigment, for example, paint, anytime we add white to a hue, we call that a tint. And anytime we add black to a pigment, we call that a shade. Now you can see, right, we do have some changes that happen to that base hue. So here in this example, we have that pure red. And then as we add white or black, notice we do get lighter or darker, but then something else is also happening where we're losing a bit of saturation. And that's the third thing that I want to talk about here. Now they are different. Value and saturation changes can look similar, but in principle they are different here. So value is the lightness or darkness to a hue, and saturation, or sometimes called chroma, is the intensity of that hue. And like I said, so it can look similar to a value change, but it is different. When we talk about pigment, which we're not using, right? I mentioned how black and white can affect the value. If we're talking about pigment, then adding gray would be how we affect the saturation of a color. When we're talking about light, though, however, we mean when we talk about the saturation of digital colors, right? We mean how much or how little other hues are being represented in that color. So saturation, again, similar to value, and in Photoshop we can see like saturation can directly be manipulated by things like opacity changes, and we'll go into that a bit more too. But those three things, hue, value, and saturation, are the three components to color. When we're talking about color and when we're looking at color images, those are the three things that I want you to keep in mind. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen the basic color wheel before, but here we go. So we have our color wheel here, and the three takeaways from the color wheel are our primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. Now, our primary colors are so-called primary, the red, yellow, and blue, because those are primary colors that cannot be mixed. So you cannot mix colors to get primaries. But with our three primary colors, you can get all of the colors in the color wheel. So we see our secondary colors are green, orange, and violet. And secondary colors are made from mixing the primaries, right? And then we have our tertiary colors, which are made from mixing one primary and one secondary. So with this information, we have a lot of different color harmonies we can now look at, and there are some that make more visual sense than others, and some that don't make sense at all, or at least they're not ideal for some things that we're trying to do. But I just want to quickly go through some of these color harmonies and just show you some examples. And again, this is just more to give you an idea about how color can operate. We'll have some projects where you're going to have some creative control over the color that you're going to be choosing, and I'd like you to be thinking about some of these harmonies and how you could go about using them to your benefit. So the first is our complementary, and again, this is um, simply when two colors are opposite each other on a color wheel. Now, oft, oftentimes, the word complementary can be mistaken for, oh, these complement each other or these would go well. That's not necessarily the case. Complementary just means that they're um, opposites, right? And here we have an example of Van Gogh's self-portrait, but oftentimes complementary colors can be really tricky to use successfully. And the reason for that is what's called simultaneous contrast, is that the two colors together can often intensify each other, and it may actually not be what you're going for. But just so we're aware, here we are. So complementary colors. Here's orange and blue as an example. And then we have triads, which yellow, red, and blue being the primary triad right there. That would be one for, so like Superman, for example, is the primary triad. But here we have a secondary triad color scheme. So we have our red and our orange and violet and green. And here's an example of a painting with the secondary triad being the color harmony that we're seeing. We have things like split complements. Now this, I would say split complements are at least my favorites. I feel like that the direct complements can sometimes be too intense. But when you take a base color here, so now we have our yellow, and instead of the actual complement of violet, we're using red violet and blue violet in this painting here. So split complements would be one way I think that using at least complementary hues could incorporate a bit better. And analogous here. Now, these tend to be naturalistic images. So here we have Cezanne, and if we think about the colors we would find in a landscape, right? All of these colors more or less sit right next to each other on that color wheel. So sometimes monochromatic images too could be considered analogous. But here we have our blue-green, our green. We even get into the green, yellow-green, and yellow here in this painting. But just so you understand that analogous would be colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And then these last two here are really close. So we have tetradic and square, or rectangle here, and these are basically when you use two pairs of complementary colors. So here we can see red green and blue orange, and using these four colors together, here's some Andre Duran from the Fauvist paintings. We see quite a bit of that yellow in there too, and that doesn't necessarily mean that this color harmony would be the only colors in a painting, but here we can definitely see those four colors being used. And the shape again, so the rectangular shape on the color wheel, right? We have three colors between the green and the orange, one color between the orange and the red, three colors between the red and the blue, and then one color between the blue and the green. So that gives us this rectangular formation here, which is very similar to our square color harmony. It's using somewhat the same principle. It's using complements, but we're separating our colors by even spaces now. So instead of the 3 and the 1, here we have even spaces of 2, 2, 2, and 2 around the color wheel. So that's just a quick overview. We're going to be going much more into color, and hopefully this will give us a starting point to think about how we can start choosing our colors in ways that make a bit more visual sense.